Unlocking the Secrets of Hermetic Philosophy. Bumps. The Kybalion. In 1908, 7 laws, lifted from a tradition that predates Christianity, Islam, and most of what you'd call Western thought. A tradition the Greeks encountered in Egypt and considered ancient even then. Here's the claim the book makes, stripped of the mysticism. Reality runs on rules. Not vague spiritual platitudes, rules. Mechanical, repeatable, testable rules. And if you don't know them, you're not exempt from them. You're just operating blind, getting knocked around by forces you never bothered to name. This is a video about those 7 rules, not as folklore, as an operating manual for your mind, your decisions, and the way you build a life that doesn't collapse the first time it gets tested. Stick around, because principle number 1 alone will change how you think about every problem you've got right now. Act 1. The origin. Why a 100-year-old book still matters. Let's deal with the history first, because it explains why this material has weight instead of just vibes. By the time the Greeks arrived in Egypt in force, after Alexander's conquest, Egyptian civilization was already ancient. Not old, the way Rome is old to us. Ancient the way the pyramids were ancient to the Romans. Egypt had a spiritual and philosophical tradition stretching back thousands of years before a single Greek temple was built. What happened next is one of the more interesting cultural collisions in history. Greek scribes, administrators, and scholars, operating under a Greek ruling class that now controlled Egypt, started writing down Egyptian philosophical and initiatory teachings, filtering them through Greek language and Greek logic. That fusion produced what's known today as the Hermetic literature, writings attributed to a legendary figure called Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, part historical composite, part mythologized wisdom teacher. This wasn't casual writing. It was, in effect, a time capsule, a record of Egyptian metaphysics compressed into a form the ancient world could carry forward, right as that civilization's independent existence was ending. If you've ever stood in front of an Egyptian monument and felt like the symbols were doing something more than decoration, that instinct isn't superstition. Egyptian priests genuinely encoded philosophy into their monuments, their rituals, their myths. It was a civilization that took the transmission of ideas across time as seriously as any engineering project. Fast forward roughly 2,000 years. In 1908, that entire sprawling tradition gets distilled, rightly or wrongly, faithfully or loosely, into 7 principles by an anonymous author or authors, publishing as 3 initiates. Historians generally point to William Walker Atkinson, a Chicago lawyer turned New Thought writer, as the man most likely behind it, though the book itself never confirms this, and the mystery is arguably part of the marketing. Worth being straight about one thing here. The 7-principle framework itself is Atkinson's own systematization. The ancient Corpus Hermeticum, the actual Greco-Egyptian texts this tradition is named after, doesn't hand you a numbered list of 7 laws. What the Kybalion did was take real Hermetic themes running through that older material and organize them into something teachable. That's a legitimate act of synthesis. It's just not a literal transcription of a 2,000-year-old document, whatever the book's framing implies. Whoever wrote it did something valuable regardless of motive. They took a sprawling, esoteric body of thought and reduced it to something usable. 7 laws, memorizable, applicable. That's rare. Most spiritual and philosophical traditions resist compression. They want you to spend a lifetime in the temple before you get the payoff. The Kybalion hands you the operating system on page 1 and dares you to test it. That's the spirit we're taking into this video, not devotion, testing. Act 2, the 7 principles, 7 laws. Each one is testable on its own. You don't need to accept all 7 to get value from one, but run them together and they stop being trivia and start being an operating system. Let's go through them in order. Principle 1, mentalism. The all is mind, the universe is mental. Here's the foundational claim, and it's a big one. The ultimate substance of reality is mind. Not matter first, with mind as an accident that showed up later. Mind first, with what we call matter as a downstream expression of it. The logic behind this claim is worth understanding because it's not just assertion. The Kybalion argues that whatever the ultimate source of reality is, call it the all, it has to be infinite, indivisible, and unchanging in essence. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken away, because if it could gain or lose something, it wouldn't be the ultimate substance, that something else would be. Matter fails this test immediately. Matter is divisible. Matter changes state. Matter can be created and destroyed in different forms. Energy fails it too, for the same reasons. The only candidate that fits the definition, the author argues, is mind itself, infinite in its potential, whole in every instance of it, undiminished no matter how it's expressed. You don't have to buy the metaphysics wholesale to extract the operating principle. And here's where it gets useful for you specifically. If the universe runs on mind at the deepest level, then your mind isn't a passive mirror reflecting a fixed world back at you. It's a tool of causation, not magic, causation. The way you frame a problem changes what solutions become visible to you. The way you interpret a setback determines whether it becomes data or trauma. This isn't wishful thinking. It's closer to how elite operators in any field, special forces selection, high-stakes negotiation, professional sports, actually train the mind as an instrument that shapes outcomes, not just registers them. This is also the principle behind everything that gets filed under the paranormal: telepathy, remote viewing, mediumship, intuition that outperforms the available evidence. You don't have to accept any of that at face value. But notice the through line. If mind isn't strictly local to your skull, if it's not just electrochemical noise confined to gray matter, then information transfer that doesn't route through the five senses stops being automatically absurd. It becomes an open empirical question instead of a closed one. Militaries and intelligence agencies spent real budget on that question in the 20th century for a reason. Whatever your conclusion, the fact that serious, well-funded skeptical institutions investigated it tells you the question wasn't as settled as it's now fashionable to pretend. Practical takeaway: stop treating your mind as a passenger in your life. Everything else in this video builds on that one shift, though as you'll see, each of the next 6 principles runs on its own distinct logic. Not just a restatement of this one. Same foundation, 6 different tools built on top of it. Principle 2. Correspondence. As above, so below. As below, so above. This is the principle that got engraved on more amulets and quoted in more contexts than any other line in the Hermetic canon, and it's usually misunderstood as vague poetry. It isn't. It's a claim about structural repetition, that the same patterns, ratios, and laws that govern the largest scale of existence also govern the smallest, and vice versa. The ancient Egyptians didn't draw a hard line between themselves and the cosmos the way modern secular thought does. They saw the human being as a microcosm, a small-scale replica of the same architecture running the universe at large. That's not just religious sentiment. It shows up in hard patterns you can actually verify. The golden ratio appearing in nautilus shells, hurricane spirals, and galactic arms. Fractal geometry, where a coastline or a fern leaf repeats the same structural logic at every scale you zoom into. Alchemy, at its core, was the attempt to apply this principle deliberately. The idea that if you understand the pattern governing large-scale transformation, you can replicate a version of that transformation on a smaller, personal scale. Here's where it gets practical for you. If correspondence is real, it means the patterns governing your personal life aren't isolated incidents. They're small-scale instances of larger patterns, and you can study the large pattern to understand the small one, or study the small one to predict the large one. This is, functionally, what every good systems thinker does, without calling it Hermeticism. The way you handle a minor conflict with a colleague is a scaled-down rehearsal of how you'll handle a major conflict with a business partner. The discipline you show in a 5-minute task correlates with the discipline you'll show in a 5-year commitment. Above and below aren't 2 separate domains. They're the same law, different resolution. This is also the underlying logic of every talisman, sigil, and ritual object across every magical tradition on Earth. The idea isn't superstition for its own sake. It's the attempt to create a small, controlled physical below that concentrates and focuses a larger, diffuse intention, the above, into something usable. Strip. Away the occult packaging, and you'll recognize the same mechanism in a vision board, a signed contract, a wedding ring, a company mission statement carved into the lobby wall. Objects that encode intention and, through repeated contact, reinforce the internal state that produced them. The ancients weren't doing something categorically different from what disciplined modern operators still do. They were doing it explicitly, with better metaphysics attached. Practical takeaway. If something in your life feels chaotic and unpredictable, stop treating it as an isolated glitch. Look for the pattern one level up or one level down. It's usually already there, and it's usually more informative than the incident itself. Principle 3, vibration. Nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. Nothing in the universe is actually static. What looks solid, a table, a mountain, your own body, is at the level physics actually operates on, a field of particles in constant high-frequency motion, held together by forces that are themselves oscillations. Solid is a perceptual category, not a physical one. The Kybalion got there through metaphysics. Modern physics got there independently through experiment, and they landed in the same place. The Hermetic extension of this principle is that mental and emotional states are also vibratory, that they operate on different frequencies, and that you have more control over which frequency you're operating on than you currently exercise. This sounds like New Age language until you translate it into something you already know from experience. A room full of people can feel tense before anyone says a word. A confident person walking into a negotiation changes the tone of the room before they've spoken. You are constantly reading and broadcasting nonverbal state. Call it vibration, call it affect, call it nervous system regulation, and so is everyone around you. Where this gets genuinely interesting is the modern physics angle the ancients obviously didn't have access to, but seem to have anticipated in principle. String theory, still unproven, but taken seriously by serious physicists, proposes that the fundamental units of reality aren't particles at all, but tiny vibrating strings, and that the specific frequency of a given string's vibration is what determines which particle and which properties show up in our observable world. Different vibrational states, different manifestations of reality, all built from the same underlying substrate. If that framework holds up, then everything is vibration, operating at different frequencies, producing different apparent realities. Stops being a mystical claim and starts being a reasonably accurate lay description of frontier physics. You don't need string theory to validate the practical principle, though. The practical principle stands on its own. Your emotional and mental state isn't whether you passively endure. It's closer to a dial you have more access to than you've been using. Athletes, performers, and hostage negotiators train this explicitly, the ability to deliberately shift internal state under pressure rather than being dragged wherever the immediate stimulus pulls you. Practical takeaway. Before your next high-stakes conversation, treat your internal state as a variable you set on purpose, not a reaction you passively absorb. That single habit separates people who get run over by their circumstances from people who walk into circumstances and change the temperature of the room. Principle 4, polarity. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. This is arguably the most immediately usable principle in the entire book, and it's worth sitting with longer than the others. The claim, apparent opposites, fear and courage, love and hate, hot and cold, aren't actually two separate, unrelated things. They're two ends of a single continuum, differing in degree, not in kind. Like and unlike are the same, the text says. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Hot and cold are both temperature, just different points on the same scale. There's no hard line where warm becomes cold. It's a gradient. The Kybalion argues the same is true of emotional and mental states, which is a far more radical claim and a far more useful one. If fear and courage are points on the same scale, rather than two separate forces battling for control of you, then you're not stuck waiting for fear to leave before courage can show up. You can move yourself along the scale directly, through deliberate mental focus, specifically by concentrating on the opposite pole. This is functionally identical to what modern cognitive behavioral therapy calls cognitive reframing, and what performance psychology calls state management. You don't Eliminate the unwanted state by fighting it head on. You shift your attention toward its opposite and let the whole scale slide in that direction. This has an immediate application to how you handle conflict, and it's one the ancient Greek philosophers converged on independently. Around 600 BCE, a Greek thinker named Anaximander made an observation that would go on to shape the entire trajectory of Western logic. Human experience seems to be organized in opposite pairs, up and down, hot and cold, male and female. Aristotle later hardened this into formal binary logic, true and false, the foundation stone of every argument you've ever constructed. But binary logic has a well-documented blind spot. It assumes every question resolves into one of two poles, when in reality a third category exists that neither pole accounts for. The unintelligible, the question that isn't actually well formed, the framing that's simply wrong. Getting too locked into an either-or frame, us versus them, win or lose, right or wrong, blinds you to the possibility that the real answer sits outside the axis you've drawn entirely. That's not mysticism. That's a documented failure mode in decision theory, and the ancients flagged it 3,000 years before it had a name. Practical takeaway. When you're stuck in a bad state, anger, anxiety, paralysis, stop trying to force it to zero. Identify its opposite pole and deliberately direct attention there instead. And when you're stuck in a bad argument, ask whether you've been trapped inside a false binary the whole time. Principle 5. Rhythm. Everything flows out and in. Everything has its tides. All things rise and fall. Polarity tells you opposites exist on a scale. Rhythm tells you that scale isn't static. It swings on a schedule, whether you're paying attention or not. Day follows night. Expansion follows contraction. Markets boom and correct. Every discipline you've built up will at some point slacken, and every low point you hit will, if you don't sabotage it, eventually swing back. The Kybalion states this as a near-mechanical law. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Effort produces fatigue in rough proportion to its intensity. Gains produce corrections in rough proportion to how far they overextended. This isn't fatalism. It's a forecasting tool, if you know how to read it. Here's the part most people miss. Because the swing is a law, not a random event, every period of difficulty you experience carries a corresponding compensation built into the structure of the swing itself. Not guaranteed comfort, but guaranteed movement. Nothing stays at the bottom of the arc any more than it stays at the top. People who understand this stop panicking at the low points because they recognize the low point as a phase of a cycle, not a permanent verdict on their situation. People who don't understand it either quit right before the swing turns or ride the high point with no plan for the correction that's coming and get blindsided when it arrives. There's a deeper layer here too, one that shows up constantly in hypnotherapy and regression work. The idea that the rhythms you're running today, the recurring conflicts, the repeating patterns in your relationships, the same mistake showing up in a new costume, often trace back to older, deeper cycles you inherited rather than chose. Whether you take that literally, as some regression therapists do, or metaphorically, as a way of describing deeply grooved behavioral patterns laid down in childhood or earlier relationships, the practical instruction is identical. You can't break a rhythm you haven't first identified. Most people are conducted by a rhythm they never chose and have never named. The people who get real leverage in life are the ones who step outside the rhythm long enough to see its shape, and then decide deliberately whether to keep dancing to it. Practical takeaway: map your own cycles, energy, motivation, discipline, mood, instead of being ambushed by them every time. And when you hit a low, resist the urge to treat it as verdict rather than phase. Principle 6, cause and effect. Every cause has its effect. Every effect has its cause. Chance is but a name for law not recognized. This is the principle that should hit hardest if you've ever described something in your life as bad luck. The Hermetic claim is blunt. Nothing happens randomly. What you call chance is simply a cause you haven't traced yet, a law operating in the dark, outside your current field of vision. This isn't a comforting bedtime story about karma. It's closer to a discipline, Refuse the explanation, "it just happened," until you've actually exhausted the search for the cause. Modern physics gives this an unexpectedly strong assist, and it's worth understanding because it's genuinely strange. At the subatomic level, particles exist in a state called superposition, not in one place, but smeared across every possible position simultaneously, described only by probability, until an act of observation forces the system to collapse into one specific, measurable outcome. The uncomfortable implication some physicists take seriously is that observation itself is a causal act. Measurement isn't passive, it's participatory. If that holds even partially true at the quantum scale, the Hermetic claim that mind is an actual cause and not just a bystander stops sounding like mysticism and starts sounding like an early non-technical description of something physics is still working out. You don't need quantum mechanics to use this principle, though. You need honesty. Every outcome in your life traces back to a chain of causes, and a meaningful number of links in that chain were decisions you made, states you were in, or patterns you were running, whether or not you were tracking them at the time. Some people try to shortcut this understanding through divination, tarot, the I Ching, not because the cards themselves possess causal power, but because the structured randomness forces a kind of forced reflection. You're compelled to sit with a symbol and generate meaning from it, which frequently surfaces a cause you'd been avoiding looking at directly. Whether or not you buy the metaphysics behind those tools, the psychological mechanism is real and well documented. Structured ambiguity produces genuine insight, the same way a good coach's open-ended question does. Practical takeaway: before you file anything under bad luck, do the audit. Trace the chain back further than feels comfortable. Most of what gets called chance is a cause you decline to look for. Principle 7. Gender. Gender is in everything. Everything has its masculine and feminine principles. This is the principle people most often misread, so let's be precise about what it actually claims before applying it, because the misunderstanding guts its usefulness. Hermetic gender has nothing to do with biological sex or social roles. It's a structural claim about how anything comes into being. Every act of creation in this framework requires an active, generative force and a receptive, formative force, and the interaction between the two is what produces a result. Your conscious mind, deliberately directing attention and intention, functions as the active principle. Your subconscious, the vast substrate that actually does the work of forming, gestating, and eventually producing the result, functions as the receptive principle. Neither one alone produces anything. A goal you consciously set but never hand off to sustained subconscious engagement stays an intention forever. A subconscious running unexamined, undirected patterns produces outcomes nobody chose. You need both functioning in the right relationship for anything to actually get built. This structural logic shows up everywhere once you know to look for it, well outside anything resembling mysticism. Binary code, the actual substrate of every piece of software running your life right now, builds every possible output from the interaction of exactly two states, an active one and zero. Astrology, whatever you make of its predictive claims, is built on the same architecture. A solar impulse representing will and active force, a lunar impulse representing receptivity and the capacity to form and contain that will into something real. You don't need to accept astrology's predictive power to recognize that the underlying structural claim, that manifestation requires both an initiating force and a receiving shaping force, is a coherent and fairly universal pattern, one that shows up in embryology, in engineering, in the basic structure of any negotiation between a proposal and a counter-response. Here's the direct application for you. Most stalled goals aren't failures of desire. They're failures of pairing. You've generated plenty of active force, ambition, intention, a plan on paper, but never built the receptive structure that would actually let it gestate into something real. The habits, the systems, the environment, the subconscious buy-in that turns a decision into a trajectory. Or the reverse. You're running strong systems and structure with no clear active intention driving them, so they produce competent motion with no destination. Real execution requires both halves working in relationship, not one overpowering the other. Practical takeaway. Next time a goal stalls, don't ask, do I want this enough? Ask which half is missing, the active push or the structure that would let the push actually take shape. Act 3. Why this isn't 7 separate ideas. Here's the thing the book itself insists on, and it's the part most summaries skip. These aren't 7 independent tips you deploy situationally. They're one system, describing the same underlying reality from 7 different angles. Mentalism tells you the raw material is mind. Correspondence tells you the pattern repeats at every scale, so what you learn small, you can apply large. Vibration tells you that mind and matter alike are in constant motion, never fixed, always adjustable. Polarity tells you every state you experience sits on a spectrum you have more control over than you assume. Rhythm tells you that spectrum swings on a schedule and the schedule is learnable. Cause and effect tells you nothing on that spectrum moves without a traceable reason. And gender tells you that turning any of this into an actual result requires pairing active intention with receptive structure. Pull any one of these out on its own, and it sounds like a slogan. Run all 7 together, and you get something closer to an actual operating system for a mind that wants to stop reacting to its circumstances and start directing them. That's what a 100-year-old book managed to do. Compress thousands of years of Egyptian and Greek philosophy into 7 working principles. Physics has spent the century since independently backing into several of the same conclusions from a completely different direction. Superposition, string theory, the observer effect, arriving at some of the same intersections without ever citing the source material. 7 things to actually do with this theory is worthless if it doesn't change what you do Monday morning. So here's the material stripped down to 7 concrete moves, 1 per principle, in order. First, before you diagnose a problem as something happening to you, run the causation audit. Ask what your own mind, your framing, your interpretation, is contributing to the situation. Half the time, the external problem hasn't moved. Your read on it has. Second, when something in your life feels like an isolated, chaotic incident, zoom 1 level up or 1 level down before you accept that. The pattern is usually already running somewhere else in your life at a different scale. Find it, and you'll understand the incident faster than by staring at it directly. Third, run a state audit before anything high stakes. Before the negotiation, the hard conversation, the performance review, check what frequency you're walking in with. Don't wait for the room to set your tone for you. Set it yourself on purpose before you walk in. Fourth, when you hit a bad state you can't shake, fear, resentment, paralysis, stop attacking it head on. Find its pole and put your attention there instead. Don't fight fear. Build the specific, concrete image of the courageous version of the action and hold it until the scale starts to move. Fifth, map your own cycles, energy, motivation, discipline, mood, instead of getting ambushed by them every time. When you hit a low, treat it as a phase of a known cycle, not a verdict on where you're headed. Sixth, the next time something goes wrong and your instinct is to call it bad luck, give yourself 60 seconds before you accept that verdict. Trace it back 1 more step than feels necessary. 9 times out of 10, there's a cause sitting in plain sight that bad luck was doing you the favor of hiding. Seventh, audit your stalled goals through the lens of active force versus receptive structure. If you've got the ambition but nothing's moving, you're missing structure, systems, habits, an environment built to receive the outcome you say you want. If you've got the structure but no motion, you're missing a clear, specific, active intention driving it. Most people fix the wrong half for years and wonder why nothing changes. None of this requires you to believe in anything. It requires you to actually run the experiment on your own life for 30 days and look at the data honestly. You don't have to accept every claim in the Kybalion at face value. Treat it the way any serious operator treats an untested tool. Run it. Measure the output. Keep what holds up under pressure. Discard what doesn't. But before you dismiss any of it as recycled New Age packaging, ask yourself a harder question. How many of the actual decisions in your life this year were made with a clear read on the cause behind them, versus how many you just filed under bad luck, bad timing, or that's just how it went? The seven principles aren't asking you to believe in anything. They're asking you to look closer at what's already running underneath the surface of your own life, and to stop pretending you're not the one holding the controls. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, the next video in this series goes deeper into how the Egyptians encoded these same principles directly into their monuments, and what that tells us about how seriously they took the idea that knowledge has to be built to outlast the civilization that produced it.